Can I build and manage my own zoo from the ground up, adding a variety of different animals into the zoo, whilst also maintaining our money and dealing with the many challenges we face? This is me spending 25 years building a zoo in Planet Zoo. And like anyone else, we have to start with the paths. So I started laying out the paths, and I wanted my staff in the middle of the area. Quickly started adding all the staff buildings I would need, making sure it was far enough that it wouldn't affect the guests. Now I had a layout I was happy with. I quickly hired some staff, and the staff work under these things called work zones, so I quickly assigned the staff to the work zones. And we can finally look at an animal we could add to the zoo. We're also using the Zoopedia, which tells you all the necessary needs of the animals. We went for the African buffalo as our first animal. So I went shopping with the little money I had, and I bought 2 of them. I had set up an area of where I wanted the enclosure to go, and I started building. I got a shape I was happy with, and then went straight into adding the shelter and other necessities for the animals. Now it was time to bring the animals in. Now they was in, it was time to do up their enclosure. So we added the body of water, and of course met their requirements. And now it was time to decorate the enclosure. So we added plenty of trees, just so it wasn't so empty. And this enclosure was done. Then I made some seating areas for my guests. Of course, had to add the education boards. And we want as much money as we can get, so the donation bins are definitely going in. I decided to add a food shop and a drink shop, as well as some toilets, just to accommodate the guests. And we were open. Of course, I ended up moving the food and drink stand because it was blocking the way, and everything looked perfect. Apart from the staff facilities, they just looked really out of place, so I thought I'd decorate them a little bit. So I covered the whole staff facility, and now it was time to decorate the inside. So the staff buildings looked a lot nicer, and it was very decorative, and it also helped improve the staff's happiness as well. Now we were searching for a new animal, and we ended up with the tapir. So I went with using no barriers and added rocks around the enclosure. I then got the animals in and started doing up the enclosure to suit their needs, and then it was on to doing up the enclosure. And there we go, the enclosure was now set up, and we just needed some education and donation bins, and we was ready to go. So now that all of that was added, this was a perfect place for our guests to come and see the tapir. We suddenly got hit with a snowstorm and had to add heaters to the enclosures for the animals, as both animals was suffering because it was too cold. Then I started improving the zoo by adding some more guest facilities like food and drink shops. Then I added some benches around so guests could sit comfortably, decoration around like benches, bins, and also lights for when it's dark. Now I wanted something more scary, so after scrolling for a while I landed with the saltwater crocodile. So I started with their enclosure by doing their water area, by flattening the ground. The water could now go in, and of course the water wasn't that deep, but that was all fine. Then I got on to doing their terrain. Now the animals were all happy, it was time to do an elevated path, just so guests would have a better view. And now it was time for the foliage. I started to add their enrichment items, but I noticed as I was checking the female that her partner was injured, so unfortunately I had to call the vet to get him taken care of. But other than that, the crocodiles were happy. It was now year 4 in the zoo, and then I got a notification that the inspector had arrived, and I was hoping that we would get good results. It took her a full day to look around the park, which was good for me, I guess, and the results were amazing. Education was lacking a little bit, but I couldn't ask for anything else. And hey, we got 5 stars in all our enclosures. Just as the inspector just left, we got a notification that one of our babies had escaped. And I was not excited for that, but then I realised it was my own fault because I didn't cover up the boundaries, so I quickly got on to doing that. Now we was moving on to the exhibits, and I went for this one so I could add 2 new animals to the zoo. So I went shopping and ended up with 2 tarantulas. So I quickly added them in, no need to quarantine exhibit animals, and then I quickly sorted their temperature as it wasn't to their liking. Then once we did that, we decided to educate our guests on what they were looking at. I went shopping again and I ended up with 2 scorpions and quickly added them into the zoo. Then educated the guests on what they were looking at. I added the donation bins and these exhibits were ready to be seen by the guests. You are just so ugly. I decided to check on my crocodiles when out of nowhere she gave birth, and not just to one, to 2 little ones, and they was adorable. But the crocodiles weren't the only one to be parents. We had a baby tapir. In fact, we had many baby tapirs. We also had baby buffaloes, 2 of them. After celebrating, I got on with some zoo maintenance and some decoration as well. At the entrance of the zoo, I added a fence and was going to decorate this. I wanted to add a statue at the beginning of the zoo just so it was something to look at as you walk in, so I added the saltwater crocodiles. I ended up adding 2 of them, and I added a bit of decoration. I added a new keeper hut. I also decorated more of the park to make it look better, and even started on a new enclosure. And I chose the spotted hyena. So we got one of them in so we could work on the enclosure. Once I got the enclosure to their liking, it was time to add the plants and the hard shelter as well. I added a few enrichment items and expanded the enclosure just a tiny bit, and the animals were now all happy. My guests were loving watching a pooping buffalo. At the start of year 12 we got another inspection report, and they weren't too fond of the crocodile habitat, but everything else was perfect. I decided to add a new exhibit and give more of a view for the guests. I added the common death adder into this exhibit. We just had to change the temperature and humidity, and the animals were happy. The zoo was shaping up quite nicely and everything was going well. I ended up expanding some paths around the zoo just so guests could have a better view of the animals. I added a roof to my guest areas so they would stay dry when it was raining, like it is now. I also attempted to do another roof on the bridge, and it looks bad, but we don't talk about it, okay? I then started expanding my zoo a little bit. Monkeys, the climbing furballs that everyone loves at a zoo. So I decided to do an area, and once I did that I started to raise it because I didn't want them to climb out, which didn't really go well. Anyway, we got on to doing their climbing first. Now I found this, which was amazing for them, so I decided to turn it around and sink it in the ground. I wanted to add my own little bits to it, so I did. I then made another accessible climbing point for them to get onto it, and then it was time to let the little ones in. And they came rushing in. Now these guys live in a colder climate, so obviously they wanted snow around, so I had to add a lot of coolers around as well. And they was already loving their enclosure. You can see this one here, and guests were also rushing to see as well. And it even started snowing. What are you? Yeah, that's how I feel as well. But because it was snowing, my hyenas were suffering and they was too cold. So I started to add some heaters in, or I was going to, until I saw that one of my monkeys had escaped. Now this was a big problem, so I quickly captured them and put them back in. I quickly fixed the enclosure so they couldn't escape anymore. I expanded my staff buildings as we was having a bit of staff issues. I also decided to add some more power facilities in as well, and water treatment. The cheetahs. I absolutely love cheetahs, and I already played around and gave them an area just so I knew where they was going, and now it was time to sink the ground in. And I used null barriers to go all the way around the enclosure. Then I added the staff gate, and we could start decorating this enclosure for them. I wanted guests to get a better view, so I decided to use fences around the front part of the enclosure. And now it was time to fill the rest of it in rocks, and plenty of them. And there we go, now we could start focusing on the actual enclosure itself. It was now time to get our first cheetah in. With her in, we could now do the terrain to their liking, and they wanted a lot of short grass, so I just covered it in short grass. Now it was time for the plants, and I mostly just added trees, as I didn't want to clutter this enclosure for them, as cheetahs like to run around a lot. I got their hard shelter in, and it was around the middle of the enclosure, so it was a good view for the guests as well. I started to place enrichment items for them just to keep them happy. I gave them a water source so they could have a drink and guests could see them a lot easier. And this enclosure was done. And off she went, running around the enclosure. And I hadn't even added the male in yet, so I was about to do that. And then guests thought the tickets were underpriced, so I quickly changed them. I tried improving their shelter before making my own. And this was a lot better and also kept them sheltered from the rain. We added the male and they was both happy and enjoying their enclosure. They are so beautiful. I decided I'd check on my hyenas well, unfortunately we've lost an animal. Rest in peace. So I called the vet and then we're gonna have to get a new buffalo. On some happier news, my cheetah gave birth to a little baby and oh, it was so adorable. Oh, and it was straight off running around. Oh my god, he's so adorable. Everyone meet Spots. My crocs have also been at it and had plenty of babies. My tarantula's welfare was quite low because once again, they've been breeding like crazy, so we did the right thing and released their kids to the wild and let them fend for themselves. My zoo had shaped up quite nicely and I was quite happy with it. In the last couple of years I started focusing on guests and giving them facilities, and also just making sure the park would be stable enough to survive. I also hired some new staff just so work would be a lot easier with them. And it was now time to leave the zoo alone and let time speed up, and let's see how the zoo can handle itself. The zoo was perfectly fine on its own and everything went well. And there we go, this is me spending 25 years building my zoo in Planet Zoo. I hope you enjoyed, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!